You're officially coming with me. You got that. Till the club gone, you can drink. You raise and we don't care what they think.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Holden Prio, and I am here providing a new take on a video that I have been really thinking a lot more about, which is getting the flip side of the coin, another person's perspective on what it's like to play against Ral. What are the points of interaction? What are the weaknesses? What have you found to be really strong as far as like the strengths of the deck? And what have you seen from playing against it that seemed like, oh, wow, this is pretty easy to blow out in this situation, or if we just do this, or if we work together on the table in a pregame conversation, etc. And so in that vein, before we get started and dive into it, I wanted to give a quick shout out. We do have an awesome Discord. The links will be in the description below, as well as on my Moxfield profile here. You can always connect with me as well on Moxfield. I love reading all the comments on different decks, and obviously this isn't the only deck that I have brewed or played. You can see quite a bit different ones here, as well as connecting with me on Blue Sky or on YouTube, and also just recently started an Instagram page for the tEDH tournament competitive commander channel that we've got going on here. So without anything else from me, I'd like to introduce a good buddy of mine, Ian. It goes by Mr. Merculeez on Discord, so I'll let you take it away. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, hey, hello. Yeah, like you said, I'm Merculeez. I'm a local cEDH player. I'm trying to get more into the tournament scene. Holden and I know each other because we participate in the same locals, and we've had a lot of games together. So I've played against Israel pretty often.
Awesome. How long have you been playing Magic or like Commander in general? Like, what's your background or experience
Oh,
from that?
yeah. I've been playing for roughly 2 years, 2.5 years now. I got started, very casually in Commander, the same way everybody else does. They pick up a precon, and put it together, and then slowly kind of drift towards the higher power end of the spectrum, and eventually wander into cEDH. My preferred sort of decks are turbo decks, fast-paced decks, but with the recent ban lists, I've been kind of playing around in mid-range, just getting a
Yeah.
feel for the format as it stands.
Well, that's cool. That's awesome. It's cool to hear like a different take or perspective from someone who's maybe newer to Magic, but has really just kind of the majority of your time already in Magic has been in Commander and in cEDH, which is super cool. What were you playing prior to the ban list?
Prior to the ban list, I was playing Corvold. I was pretty much all in on just the the big Fakers King right there, and
Hell
I
yeah.
loved it. It was a great deck.
Yeah, and you were an awesome pilot on it. It was always scary sitting down in a pod, seeing you there, just because it kind of felt like you won out of nowhere all the time, and it was super resilient too. Because in response to anything that was happening, you just draw more cards, make more treasures and tokens. So,
Yeah,
yeah. Well, rip Corvell. Maybe the unbans will shake things up. Who knows? But
here's hoping.
yeah, definitely. Fingers crossed. It would be cool to see some changes. But yeah, so why don't we just kind of dive right into it? We'll keep this conversation a little bit shorter than maybe some of the other interviews and that kind of stuff that I've done. But I'd love to just hear a little bit more perspective about what have you seen from basically what did you notice early on, like when I first started playing this deck and when we were in games together, like what was your initial impression and your thought process, and then maybe if you can, like how has that changed over time, and kind of like what do you think about it now?
Okay, well, sitting down from a deck I knew nothing about, especially with the limited amount of experience I had at the time, um, it felt innocuous. It felt very
Sure.
unassuming. Like if nobody describes to you what Ral does, the first
Right.
game you sit down with it, like majority of the time, and it was a very eye-opening experience very quickly to how explosive the deck can be.
Right.
And
So it sounds like there's a
going
lot of that brewer's advantage at first, right? Where it's like you just kind of don't know what to expect. So it's a little hard to assess, like, how scary is this? How fast is this? Like, when is it going to go off? Is it an instant speed deck? Is it a sorcery speed? Like, all that stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that you have at first that the deck answers very quickly,
Mm,
right? It kind of, you have a checklist of things you look for when you first sit down with a deck you don't know what its game plan is initially. And Ral is just one of those decks that it'll see all the questions you're asking and it'll present you very quickly what it is it's trying to do. And in that scenario, it is very scary because it's turbo in a way that is different than just the way you would look at regular turbo decks. You
Hmm.
know?
Okay, so I'm curious. So, uh, like, what does that look like for you? Because I think I have a very like clear opinion about it, obviously, but I'm pretty all in on this deck, right? So I don't want to
Yeah,
taint it with
yeah,
my experience, but I'm just curious, like, how do you see Ral as a turbo deck as opposed to other turbo decks? And I know we've had these conversations in the past, like,
yeah,
and I've very tongue in cheek been like, "Oh, this is faster than Rogside," blah blah blah. But
yeah.
if we're being very literal about it, like, kind of how do you see it, and like, what are your comparisons like? Because you are someone who has
Um,
turbo experience, right?
yeah. I played a lot of Rogsai. I played a lot of Corvold, and I play Rogsai even now. But I think the thing that most tables are trained to look at are payoffs,
Mm,
right? They are trained to be like, okay, this guy's turboing, he's ritualing into something, right? And that something is the thing that the table is aware that they have to counter, right? Like maybe a necropotence or an ad nauseum or some big explosive spell, or something of that nature. Whereas Ral, I think, takes advantage of that sort of Pavlovian training in a way that
hmm.
um, their payoffs are already on the board, right? Like the table is letting things slide where they shouldn't, right? Because
Mm,
Ral requires its rituals, it requires its mana. So anything that sticks to the board, like a mana vault, a soul ring, their pyretic rituals, those things are increasing storm count. They are giving the Ral a ton of resources, even though it's innocuous, right? I'm gonna
yeah.
say that word a lot because I feel like Ral capitalizes on this quite often in these games.
Yeah, it
Where,
definitely is like the wolf in sheep's clothing, where it's like, write a flame on the stack. And in any other deck, you'd be like, yeah, whatever. But in Ral, I
Mhm.
can tell you as an entrenched player here, you really should be asking yourself that question. Like, do we let this resolve? Like, I might need to blow my mental misstep here.
Yeah, because I think the thing people are waiting for to hit the stack isn't going to hit the stack because Ral is already on board. The payoff would be Ral flipping, you know,
Hmm.
and I mean, in a large majority of those cases, right? That's ultimately what the deck wants to do. And I know that there's lines that are very complicated, wherein like you'll be returning the favor of storm triggers to kind of build a huge amount of damage on board that doesn't really require Ral to be there, but
Sure.
he certainly helps.
Yeah, it's
And
not. I wouldn't say the deck is built to be truly commander agnostic. It can win commander agnostic, and
yeah,
honestly, there have been some recent changes. Big shout out to D Mage, one of the mods in our Discord, who has proposed some of these things, so that now we have like Ruby Medallion and Helm of Awakening, so that like even if there is a Dranith and we can't reduce some of this stuff through Ral's reduction, the passive mana reduction, we have ways to kind of get around it. But yeah, no, you're totally right. This is a deck that wants and needs to play its commander, but it doesn't. Unlike other decks where like the commander is the combo piece, it's almost like here the commander is the engine, and then eventually the payoff. So it fills two roles. So I totally see what you're saying.
yeah, and because it's such like it's attacking, I guess the with a turbo identity from such a weird and like non-intuitive angle that it's hard for players who haven't experienced Ral to know when to interact or to how to handle the deck because Ral checks a lot of boxes that you wouldn't think just looking at the card. You'd see it and be like, oh, it's just a cost reducer, right? But
Hmm.
it has built-in evasion. It has its built-in payoffs. It makes all of your spells cheaper, so that way you're able to play more cards with less resources. Like it is, and it's also pretty tanky too. He's like a 1/3, right? So
Yeah,
like killing it is very difficult just right off the rip, especially with how early it's going to be presenting wins. Like nobody's going to have like a Bowmasters and then have other people's draw engines online enough to kill Ral on the stack, right? Like if that's not a very common scenario, right?
and on top of that too,
And
it's hard to convince a table that they should force of will a Ral on turn one when it was like the play pattern was like land, Rite of Flame, Ral. It's like, really? You don't think it's better to
Yeah,
hold up the force of will for the TNK player that's coming up next, or the ROG side, or whatever? Like, so I can totally see what you
yeah.
mean. It's yeah. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, no, no. It's totally fine. I mean, like you're 100% right. Like the politics around RAL are very difficult. If you're going to be making these pregame conversations with other players who you may not know about a deck that they may not know, it'll be very hard to convince them because the thing is you're also their opponent too, right? You
Hmm.
could just be like trying to set yourself up for a better hand, make
Yeah.
them blow their interaction on things because like nobody's going to be like, I need you to mental misstep this guy's mana vault. Like there's
Yeah.
nothing like that where it's going to be like the guy's like, I have no idea what this deck does. I'd rather save it for something like maybe a vampiric tutor or
Yeah, or a crop
something
rotation
more
for sure.
commonplace.
Yeah.
Yeah, or crop rotation, sure. Oh yeah. um
Anyways,
yep. Anyways.
not that I would ever do that. Okay, well, so I guess what I would ask you is, so we have an upcoming local. That's the last one was 40 plus players, so this one should hopefully bring a similar turnout. So my question, I guess, would be, going into a tournament like that, whether it's me that you're sitting down in a pod with, or if you're sitting down against somebody else, and let's say they happen to be on RAL as well. I know it's not like the most common deck right now, but let's just assume for a second that you get paired into a
Mhm.
pod and that's what you see. What if you're being totally honest with yourself and like realistic of if you could try to put yourself in the mindset of like, round one, sitting down, RAL is in, I don't know, seat three, you're going before them. What what do you have a pregame conversation? And if you do, can you walk me through a little bit of maybe what that looks like?
Okay, so round one, um, it might not be as bad. I will attempt to have a pregame conversation. I will tell the table like, hey, um, if you are unfamiliar with the way RAL works, this is a deck that is incredibly fast. It may not look like it on its surface, but it will be trying to push when attempts turn one or turn two.
Hmm.
Um, and you don't have to take my word for it. We can totally just eat this game one, round one loss, and then later in the tournament, you'll be a believer. Because the thing is, I also did this with a snack, right?
Oh,
Like,
right. Yeah.
yeah, that first game, I was totally silent. I didn't let anybody know what was Raul was doing. They saw him win turn two. I was super silent, didn't say a single word. I let Snack know what he could do in some of those lines, but that was it.
Yeah.
And then the following game, those guys were believers. They were like, we have to keep interaction. We have to do this, and the other. So I was like, I'm a full believer of like, you know, uh, words only do so much. It's really the experience that teaches the players like what they should be doing, you
Cool.
know?
So that's
So
more
round
from
one,
that's the brewer's advantage, I guess, conversation, right? So let's say,
yeah.
for example, these are players. Uh, let's just say coincidentally that we got paired into a round one where it was uh, all locals who already know about RAL and have played against it more than two or three times, right? What does that
Okay.
conversation look like? Like someone who already understands what the deck does. Like, I guess what I'm getting at is like, does the conversation look identical to the one that you would have maybe if it was a ROG side player? And if it's different, how? Like, what's different about it?
Well, I mean, so because as a ROG side player, I've definitely sat down at tables and they've been conversations about like, hey, we have to keep at least a mental misstep, or if we can try and set up some sort of free interaction, like a force of fierce, or sorry, force of negation, force of will, something like that.
Hmm.
Um, with RAL, I guess it depends on seed order. If they're turn one, I would strongly recommend that the table keep some sort of interaction, like a mind break trap or something. I mean, they don't necessarily have to show me. I'm not going to
Right.
be that aggressive at a local tourney. Um,
But I guess what I would ask you
but
is, would you actually say that to them? Like, would you say, okay, he's in seat one, you need to keep a piece of free interaction? Like, would you be that explicit?
I would be very explicit. I'd be like, yes.
Interesting. Okay.
I would be very much like, if the moment you see, like, I would strongly recommend the table, hey, if we can keep at the very least a mental misstep or something, because a turn one mana vault, while it doesn't seem like a strong play, is very, very powerful in that deck. And
Hmm.
keeping you off of mana that's permanent going into your next turn, like 5 mana is pretty strong potentially, you know?
Yeah.
And it depends on how low you've mulliganed. Like there's a lot of factors that kind of go into this. Like
Sure.
If you deep sculpt down to like a 4 or a 5, I mean a 5, I'd still be pretty scared of going turn 1. A
Mhm.
4, less so a little bit. I would be kind of, I would definitely be waiting to see how low you go and actually follow mulligan rules, even if it's round 1 Swiss. I don't care. Like I will be very like wary of the deck.
Gotcha. That's good to hear. I'm just like, it helps me to have a better understanding. And I'm sure probably for our viewers who are either interested in playing the deck, interested in trying to play against the deck, or maybe they already play and they're trying to get a better
Mhm.
perspective about your opponents. Like, what are they thinking when you're playing against them? Like, how are they, like, if you can put yourself in their shoes. And I think that that's maybe something that we don't do enough of in cEDH as a community, which is like, playing out the decks you don't understand or you feel like are just kind of this enigma or mystery to you, or like maybe isn't your play style, is a good thing because it helps you to learn from that. I mean, and I don't preach to the choir here because you try out a lot of different lists, which is awesome. But yeah, I think that that's super important. I guess I would ask you, you started to hint at this, but that would be kind of like round one. That's how you would handle things. What does the conversation look like if you're in a top 16 or a top four match when it's an untimed round and it's more likely that the players you're playing with are at a higher caliber or skill level because obviously they've made it that far, and their decks are less likely to be fringe? It's possible, but less likely.
Um, I mean, there's a lot of context to that. It
Sure.
asks myself the question: what am I playing as a player? What is the seed order, the pod composition?
Hmm.
Um, and I like to. I mean, I play. I'll usually play to the table. Like for instance, if I'm on turbo myself and there's a top 16, we happen to both be in the game. My pregame conversation is going to be a little bit different than.
Right.
I mean, I guess it'd be difficult because if I was playing Rogsai,
Right.
it's easier for Ral to deflect onto me
Yep.
that I'm the issue because I'm the more well-known turbo deck. Even though the I feel like Ral is consistently able to push wins turn 2, whereas Rogsai
It's a bit more
it has
resilient,
the
right?
potential. Like
Like
yeah,
Rockside can
both
can,
decks are
can mid
fast.
range if it needs to, right?
Yeah, it can't. It's not its strong suit by any means, but it
Right.
can do. It can do a little bit more, even if it does sort of fizzle out early on, right?
Hmm.
But if it's like 3 mid-range players and then Ral, like it's more of a conversation of I feel like we all have the strength and the ability to keep hands that are interactive in some way, shape, or form. And in the top 16, I feel like the pressure is even greater because you have a lot of these micro decisions, you have a lot of these intricate I guess just decision trees that you're presented with, right? Because you have to
Yeah.
also be aware that even in the pregame, you guys share the same goal of like trying to survive the early rounds. You're still each other's opponents, right? So you still have to have some sort of game plan in your hands, or hopefully mulliganing to something like that. So that way you're not just focused on stopping one player, you know.
Definitely.
And
Yeah.
it almost feels
Collusion.
like diffusing a bomb, right? Like, oh, I mean, I guess it would also be like it would be like collusion, I guess. Yeah, if you want
No,
to put
it's
put
not
a
actually. It's anybody out there. Don't
yeah,
don't get your panties in a twist. This is one of those
yeah,
things where a pregame conversation, in my opinion, isn't collusion. What is collusion is when you start to get into the conversation of like, if you all keep these hands and show me your hands and like we work together, then we can guarantee one of the three of us goes to the top four. Like that's where you start to get into the collusion conversation. And sure, it's a grayscale there, and it's like a bit of a balancing act. But I mean, it makes sense, right? Like it's essentially saying like, there's three tortoises and a hare in the pod. Well, the tortoises are incentivized to want to make it go as long as possible, whereas the hare just wants to do like a single sprint early. And if the game
yeah.
goes long enough, the tortoises are going to eventually win that race, right? And that might not be the best example or whatever, but I'm sure anybody can understand where I'm coming from, which is like, the mid-range decks have the ability to grind and to if the game goes to turn 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and longer, especially in untimed rounds, they're winning those games. Like Ral just has no chance. That's not what it's built to do. Every card in the deck is selected to do the opposite. So yeah,
Mhm.
I think those pregame conversations are totally fine. So I part of me does feel like it is a dangerous territory, and you have to be careful about what you say, especially with all of the recent conversations that have been happening in the community around collusion and bribery and things like that, which are like I mean, for good reason, right? But yeah, I think what you're talking about is more like making sure everybody's on the same page. Hey, we got to make sure we actually respect this deck, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I feel like if it makes it to the top 16, inherently players should be like, this deck does something, right? It
Right.
does the thing
They
it
should at
makes.
least
Yeah,
be aware at that point.
yeah. Like the guy didn't just fall up some stairs and land into a top 16 pod. Like the deck, it has
Yeah.
legs. It's got things it can
Whoops!
do.
It just like slipped
Yeah,
into the top 16. Yeah, I kind of feel like that happens sometimes with some people, but yeah, for sure.
yeah, I guess. But yeah, like the deck, it feels like it is diffusing a bomb.
Hmm.
Like it's literally. I mean, you're watching this Row player tick up Storm. You're watching him get to his magic number 6. Like it's literally like a count up.
Instead of a
But like
countdown.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. It's the higher the number gets, the more pressure you feel. Like, and it gets to a point where it's just like you're literally hoping if you have nothing you can do, you're just like praying for luck. You're like, I hope this guy just flips nothing, and then Raul does nothing. The turn fizzles, and it gets to the next player.
Yeah.
And in that scenario, it never feels good. It has an immense amount of pressure on it. It does remind me a lot of like watching Rogsai Storm, right? Like, because you're dead. You're just
Yeah.
waiting for like the shoe to drop, and Rowlet has that already kind of all packaged in itself, because you're
Hmm.
watching the payoff just eventually blow up and it ult, and at
Yeah,
that
that's a
point
good
you're like,
point. It
there's
kind of
nothing I can do.
it does feel like once a Rockside pilot has an ad nauseum resolve, then you're just
Hmm.
like, all right, yeah, I'll count your life for you. Let's go. And then you're just like
Yeah,
flipping
let's
over like
go.
free mana after free mana after free mana. And then eventually they just hit like a
Yeah,
flash enabler and a payoff and a tutor. And they're at like 9 or 10 life. And you're like, okay, yeah, we're dead. And with Ral, it's a
yeah,
little bit different, right? Like where the time you needed to interact in that moment was pre Adnos. With Ral, it isn't always clear where you're supposed to interact. I mean, and obviously, and we've talked about this before. We've built this deck this way on purpose to make it very difficult for people to try to find their windows to interact. But yeah, I agree with you that it does end up kind of feeling similar, but in different moments, I guess. So, in the interest of time, I wanted to move on to ask a question about what do you feel like when you're actually playing in a game and there are like a let's think of a good example. Like an opposing player plays a vexing bobble, for example. Like, do you walk them through that conversation of like, hey, this is probably going to help Raul more than you realize, like more than it's going to help you, kind of thing? Like, do you try to like talk people through some of the play patterns? Because my understanding is that you have played some reps on the deck as well, and you're definitely very familiar with it. So do you
hmm
do you start to kind of like help people to not make those mistakes when they're maybe presenting a stacks piece that they don't realize is actually going to help the RAL pilot more than they realize?
I mean, yeah, I would definitely have the conversation with the fellow because I mean, I think this is assuming we've had the pregame conversation,
Sure.
and I mean, if the pilot has, after hearing how explosive the deck is, decides to then be like, I want to put a silence onto the field and help Ralph, I would just be like, well, I don't know why this individual is throwing the game this way. I
Hmm.
would try and present it in a more eloquent fashion, of course. I'd be reminding him, be like, hey, I know you think you're turning off his free mana rocks, but a lot of his rituals are pipped, you know,
Hmm.
and we don't have the ability to interact with him beyond, like, assuming we don't have lands or anything in play yet. Um, I would just kind of cautiously remind this player, like, we are treading in very dangerous territory. Like,
Oh yeah.
Vexing Bauble is, it's like a nuanced card. Like, it goes in some Rogside lists as well.
Yeah.
But it's meant to protect winning lines. But because Rao requires a lot of red mana, it doesn't really care so much about having the free rocks or anything of that nature. If anything, the worst it can do is just increase his storm count. Like the Rao
Hmm.
can definitely just play around Vexing Bubble and even utilize it to some degree to shut off opposing player stuff. And the thing is, it's also happened in games where someone has played a Vexing Bubble and I've taken full advantage of it because I'm
Oh
like,
yeah.
cool, a free silence and I get to do my thing. So like
Yeah, it's a
I
scary
don't know.
card that you have to be it could be a double-edged sword for sure.
Yeah,
And I guess on the
definitely not a turn one play for Ral or with a Ral in the pod. No.
right, yeah. So I guess on the flip side of that, when a RAL player maybe plays like a turn one Helm of Awakening and passes, how much does it actually help you as the
Oh,
opponent?
not at all. Really, the thing is, so like I play a lot of ad nauseum decks mostly, so I am not really too worried about like getting a discount for things I'm already just paying a single pip for in the first place,
Hmm.
right? A lot of people think that Helm of Awakening is very helpful in some instances, and it's not like it's not unhelpful, but a lot of the things you're trying to do, Ral is already 100% geared to do better. Like sure your Ristic Study now costs 2 mana, but like Ral basically says all of my spells just cost a single pip now, or they're just straight up free. Like Mana Vault becomes a colorless dark ritual.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
it's such a strong play for Ral to kind of take advantage of. And I would be telling the table, hey, it may not look like it. This is a red flag. You need to prepare for a very strong secondary turn.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, cool. That's how I see it as well. But I'm just always curious from my opponent's perspective, like how do they see it? Because there have been times where I've put a Helm of Awakening on a stack, and it literally feels like one of my opponents is like salivating. They're like, "Oh yes, can't wait to get all this discount on free extra." Like they'll even say like, "This affects everybody, right?" I'll be like, "Yep, it sure does." But in my mind, I'm like, it affects me way more than it affects anybody else. So
Yeah,
I don't care that much about it. But yeah, I'm just always curious other perspectives about that. Um,
yeah.
the
I
I
think
guess. Oh,
if I had
sorry.
a
Go ahead.
sorry, I was going to say if I had a closing sort of note to think about for Ral, it would be simply that I think the important piece to kind of keep aware of is to see how many cards they have left in their hands as they're going through their plays. Because the lower that number gets, the fewer options Ral has
Hmm.
ultimately. And when you're attempting to deal with Ral, I feel like a lot of people will try and like I don't know swords or kill Ral early in its storm count. I don't think necessarily that's the best way because, like I said, Ral's flips, those coins or those triggers that it puts on the stack, are essentially pieces of evasion.
Yeah.
So the more of those that go on the
I'll,
stack,
real
and the
quick.
more,
Sorry. I'll
yeah,
just put a pin in what you're saying really quick for a split second for anybody who's listening at home that doesn't understand what that means. What Merculeez is talking about here is basically that. As you can see on screen here, Ral says that whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell during your turn, flip a coin. If you lose the flip, it deals the damage to you. If you win the flip, you may exile Ral. If you do, return to the battlefield, transformed under its owner's control. And when it comes back, it's a planeswalker on the other side, right? So a great point to remember about when playing this deck or when playing against it is that if anybody has anything targeted at Ral, like a swords, like an Otawara, like just anything targeted whatsoever, every instant and sorcery that can go on top of it, like let's say you have Born Upon a Wind and you can put another sorcery on top or any instant in the deck, you now have a 50-50 chance of it also just coincidentally saying counter that Swords to Plowshares essentially. Because if you win the flip, it will exile, become a new game object, and now the original piece of removal will fizzle. So sorry to go back to what you're saying that about
yeah,
wanting to remove Ral early on the flip sequence.
yeah. So in those scenarios, when he has more resources in hand than he has presented on the stack, Um, Ral has the option of either just flipping to evade your removal, or he could just let it resolve, and he still has mana to recast Ral because Ral is such a low CMC commander. And if
Good
he
point.
has like a Helm of Awakening or something, Ral is still just cheap as hell to play, right?
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that he is showing that the Ral player is showing you how many resources they've used in their from their hands on the stack. So the more information you know, and the less cards they have hidden to you, the better off you are, even though it feels like walking the knife's edge. Because if you are, this is why it feels like disarming a bomb. Because if your timing is wrong and you interact in a at the wrong moment, Ral can play around it. And if you aren't cognizant of what's available in Ral's graveyard, because I've seen you win a game with a lava dart, and it's such an innocuous card, and because it just gives you that 50-50 option of flipping Ral, and you're like, now I'm safe. I've lost
Yep,
my Magic Stakes. Like it is like it's a very, very tricky deck, and you need to be very well prepared for how you are interacting with it on the stack in response to its triggers. And it's hard to get that across to players who've never played against the deck in that pod because a lot of them will just be their instinct will be to try and kill Ral right away when you have like 4 cards left in your hands or 5 cards left in your hand. I'm just like the deck is filled with instants and sorceries, and majority of them are just ritual instants. Like, and it just gets so much more momentum because maybe those instants also exile cards like for the impulse draws, which means you see more information. Your hand size increases. Some of them dig deeper and they put a Ral trigger on a stack, so they replace themselves. They're cantrips. Like, it is, it's hard to kind of make pods understand that from the get go. So that's why I feel like it's a very strong deck for again like just in general, but especially if you don't know what it does.
for sure. Yeah, I think it's one of those decks that they're very much so rewards the pilot who puts in a huge amount of time to learn all the lines. Like that's important. This is not a deck I feel like that you can just pick up and immediately do well. You can fall into wins
Oh
just
yeah,
because you count to six and you flip Ral and oops, I won the game. But if you're playing against opponents who really understand the deck and you haven't played Ral before, it's very easy to fumble and to make mistakes or to sequence things wrong, like that kind of thing. And then on the flip side,
yeah,
it also really rewards the opponents if they deeply and fundamentally understand the deck. Then all of a sudden, they know where to try to interact. So I'd like to just kind of wrap up with one kind of final question, which is when you're playing against Ral, what are the 1 or 2 cards that you feel like are the scariest cards that you see put on the stack that aren't obvious,
oh
right? Like, sure, it's obvious that a Jessica's Will is just like insane, but what's a card that like when it gets put on the stack, you kind of need to like look to the rest of the table and be like, hey, you need to be worried, and here's
oh
why.
bonus round,
Yeah,
bonus round,
that's a
100%
big one.
bonus round. Bonus round. I mean, everybody can look at Passing Flames and be like, "Oh, he has a massive graveyard. That's great." But bonus round, it is so weird. In that game, I never saw anybody snap pass on a bonus round so quickly when these people didn't know what the deck does. It just baffled me, and I was like, "We're dead." They don't know it, but we're dead. Like,
Yep. Yeah, it's you
um,
don't even know, but you're already dead.
yeah,
For sure. Yeah, bonus round puts in work. The red essentially because it's reduced by Ral. Red sorcery until end of turn. Whenever a player, so anybody, including your opponents, whenever any player casts an instant or sorcery spell, that player copies it. May choose new targets for the copy. It just does all the things you want to do in this deck. You know, it just gives you inevitability, gives you weird situations where you can go infinite with Magecraft triggers and Storm Kiln Artist. It makes it really hard to counter anything, and it also just gives you like doubling up on all your effects, like all your rituals and your cantrips and wheels and everything else.
yeah, and also those other spells that allow you to cast another spell for virtually free, like the Kari Zeb effects, and that I
Mm,
think is Zia Torres Justice or something. Like those 2-for-1 spells are also innocuous because they give you 2 Ralph flips essentially, or 2 chances,
Oh, you're
and
saying,
it's
I
a
thought you were
lot of
saying like with
advantage.
bonus round, but you're just saying those cards in and of themselves are scary.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they anytime that 1 card turns into 2 card flips for you
Hmm.
is is scary because if you play it late enough, that 1 card, like maybe you're on a 4. Now you get to your 5 and 6 with just one
Yeah.
card, as opposed to spending 2 resources. Because, like I said, the more I know from your hand on the stack, the more secure I feel about interacting with Ral. But the more information you can keep to yourself and still get your Ral count higher, the scarier it becomes. You
Mm.
know,
Yeah,
because
that's a really
it's
good
like a
call.
game of yeah, it's a very nuanced game of how to kind of play against Ral in those scenarios.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Well, I guess with a parting note, I would just ask, what is the lowest number of untapped lands that you think you will ever see in a cEDH deck? Because I know you've seen me play 16 untapped lands, and I'm just curious if you think at any point in time this deck will ever get any lower.
I think the lowest amount would be 6, but that's only because there's oops all spells variants in 3 colors, I
Mm.
guess.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially
Yeah.
yeah, if you're skirting the rules of of Magic, and to be able to do like Charbelcher things or the Oops All
Hmm.
Spells sort of Battle Straight Spy shenanigans. Okay, yeah, yeah. All right, you got me there.
Yeah.
That's totally fair.
Yep.
Well,
Gotcha.
cool. Hey, I appreciate so much you making the time to have this conversation with me, and it's always cool to get a little bit more insight from people who have played against the deck and had a bunch of reps. And listen, I will say, when I sit down in a pod with you, you are one of the opponents that I'm thinking like, shoot, I need to play super tight. Like, I need to make sure that I am not uh, going too fast. I'm not missing triggers. Like, if I miss the ordering of triggers, like if there's a Bergie and a Ral in play and I miss the order, and sometimes you'll let the Ral flip, and then in response to the Bergie trigger, when I have no mana in my mana pool, then you'll go for a silence or a removal piece or whatever. Like, you always find the right window if I give it to you. So yeah, it's been an honor to have you on and to get through a little bit of a conversation about this, and hopefully we can talk a little bit more in the future.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Yeah. You take care.